That's never mind.
It's not just cyber-sociology. We also do.
That's on these reviews, you know.
$42. I think when it's like 2 shirts.
Well, but that's a
Very short wait. Well, if I was to program this, they'll just have like a sine wave and just have an absolute value. Done, and it's just randomized. For coefficient. That basically the sine of Raman's drawing side wave. But yeah, it is changing.
Oh, we're gonna put it's not meant for kids. Virtual max, right? It's gonna be always a half rotation for it's almost rating using.
Yeah. Well, there's some random people. I like it one of those really high versions and international.
All right, now we're ready. All right, so first of all, last week we had a power outage. Most people weren't here, I understand. And honestly, the only reason that we even held class at all is because I was already here and there was a handful of students that were here ready to go. So otherwise, we probably wouldn't have done it at all. If you missed it, I did post that up on Canvas, so you can go back. You missed about half or so of this unit, but that's okay. We're going to backtrack a little bit today. Shouldn't miss too much. It was mostly an introduction to digital citizenship. Oh, right. I also rushed through a lot of that material because I for some reason had it in my head that the midterm exam opened up on Sunday. Not so. It opens up at the end of this week. So I was panicking for nothing. So just keep in mind, next week, starting up on the 30th, Sunday at midnight, is the midterm exam. You'll have 2 attempts. We keep the highest attempt, 40 questions, multiple choice, true, false, a few multi-select. What else? Oh yeah, there's a study guide that's up on Canvas as well. It's not the greatest study guide I've ever written. It's pretty vague. So in order to assist you out even farther, there is a practice quiz. I didn't bother to link, so I'll do that now. Practice quiz. There we go. That's just 4 questions. They're ungraded. It's just to give you an idea of the kind of questions you're gonna deal with, more or less. So between the study guide, the midterm, and having 2 attempts, I honestly cannot help you any farther than that without giving you the answers. But I'm just not willing to do that. That's not clear. I think you'll be all right. I also would like to make you aware of your next paper assignment. I have not gotten yet to completing the grading for the last one. I made the mistake of having too many damn things and too many damn classes due all at once, and I'm buried. So I just dug my way through the graduate classes. This one's next on my list. I should get that taken care of in a day or 2. The next one, due on the 6th, you got about 2 weeks to handle this one. Should be not too bad. What we asked you to do in this paper is to look at human vector attacks. You have to watch one of these videos. These are videos from different conferences about social engineering. Of the 3, the one that I recommend most is the last one here, DerbyCon, which is given by Christopher Hadagny, I think his name is. He's the one who wrote the book, Hacking Humans. He also appears in a couple of other videos at conferences. He goes out to conferences all the time. He's one of those kind of people, spends all of their time when they're not actually at work at conferences, running social engineering villages and stuff like that, sharing what he knows with everybody else. So that's the one I recommend, but all of them are fine. Go ahead and pick any one you want. The first part of the paper will be to essentially do a substantive and contextual analysis per the instructions in the syllabus on the talk The second part is to come up with your own hypothetical social engineering scenario for how you would gain access to a hotel room without using the key. I don't want covert entry methods. I don't want destructive entry methods. Don't give me a paper that says I'd take an axe to the door. Well, yeah, no shit, that will work. It's not the objective. We want you to get in without using lockpicks, without cloning a card, without using a sledgehammer or any of that stuff. For example, wearing your arm in a sling to provide the impression you are injured, to play upon sympathy and get an authorized person to hold the door open for you, right? Tailgating them. Or pretending to be a member of maintenance staff, needing to get into the room to fix a technical problem you have invented. Do not use those two examples. They are only examples. Okay. Oh, and once again, all of the format and everything, you know, don't worry about it. 1.5 to 5 pages, just like always. All right. And honestly, between the two, this second one right here is probably a paragraph. All right. You don't have to go for several pages inventing a legend and backstory and writing a script. Just come up with a scenario, a paragraph. The rest of it should be the first part here. Okay. All right, let's get to it. So last time, for the few students that were here, a lot of them rushed home directly afterwards to erase their history because we were learning about all the illegal things that everyone does all the time. Like, for example, cyberbullying and cyber harassment, which is illegal in Wisconsin, amounts to the unlawful use of a computerized communication system, particularly when making threats or other harassment. In Wisconsin, we do have a harassment statute that does include contact via computer systems, which requires only 2 or more instances over an unspecified period of time to constitute what's known as a course of conduct or a course of contact that satisfies the requirement for stalking. And if so, then you could be convicted of a Class B misdemeanor or Class B forfeiture. In Wisconsin, we classify all of our crimes according to letters. It's not the way it's done in all jurisdictions, of course, but for us, that's just how we do it. And a Class B is definitely on the bad side. It's definitely not one you want. It is a misdemeanor in this case. It can, in certain cases, be elevated to a felony. Wisconsin uses a system, along with several other states, that are known as aggravating factors. So, like, for example, if I am trespassing on someone's property, it's probably a misdemeanor, and that means that I could be fined, jailed short term, but nothing too serious. But I carry lockpicks around with me, and if the police catch me trespassing with lockpicks, that would be considered an aggravating circumstance. I could be arrested with attempted burglary, and that would be a felony charge, and so on. So you have to be careful in Wisconsin with those kinds of things. But basically, harassment in Wisconsin is basically sending messages that people don't much like to frighten, intimidate, threaten, abuse, or harass. And that is a standard that is set by the victim. If they feel harassed, they're harassed, essentially. It's not as simple as all of that, because if you go to trial, then that's the kind of thing then that would be presented the objective or reasonable person standard. But for the police to intervene, it requires nothing more than the victim to feel harassed. The question was, what's a Class B forfeiture? Well, that's lesser than a misdemeanor. Essentially what it means is that you would simply receive a fine or might otherwise be penalized in some fashion for committing the offense. And that's only 2 or more contacts carried out over time. The actual statute does not specify a length of time. It doesn't say within 24 hours, 48 hours, a week, 5 years. It doesn't say. Essentially just continuing to contact a person constitutes a course of conduct. All right, that's about where we left off. Moving on to wire fraud, and now we're actually going to start talking a little bit about cybercrime victimology. Last time, we were talking about cyber harassment, cyberbullying victimology, and what it can lead to. Pivoting a little bit because each crime is going to have different victimology. Each crime is different. Each crime is going to have different motivations, going to have different offender types, different modus operandi, different means to achieve, different opportunity to achieve, and so on. So when we're talking about wire fraud in terms of computer crime, still to this day, the elderly are the primary victims. which is why when we watched Kit Boga a couple weeks ago, or if you had a chance to check out Scammer Payback or Jim Browning or any of those other scam baiters out there, they will invariably adopt a persona of an older person because that's what the scammers are expecting. As a matter of fact, because of the flow charts, the data flows that the scammers will use in order to pluck sheep from the flock, generally, if they hear a younger voice, they won't even pursue it. They'll just give it up, simply because they are more familiar with technology, more likely to be less confused by the techno babble and so on. So they choose older victims. They tend to just self-select, and those that don't will be selected manually. So the primary victims of wire fraud are the elderly, particularly those generally on fixed incomes with a functional literacy at best when it comes to technology. The functionally illiterate and casual user varieties, by the way, this is 303. If you haven't taken 361 yet, or if you're in 361, we haven't gotten to this unit yet. Those are labels as they're used in what's known as the Steele typology. The Steele typology is it was created by this guy with an awesome name, another professor at the University of Michigan named Chad M. Steele, who came up with a way of classifying users in a computer system in order to profile them. And the two lowest categories are the functionally illiterate and the casual user. Functionally illiterate would be people like generally, I mean, not to paint everyone with the same brush here, but we are talking about profiling. But generally older people or people who have no previous experience with technology, who basically learn via rote memorization how to do certain things. And if any curveball gets thrown their way, if they have to deviate from what they've memorized as far as how to operate the computer goes, they simply have no idea what to do. So like if their shortcuts disappear on the desktop, they're completely lost, that kind of thing. Casual users encompass most technology users these days. And I know that in classes like this, with all of you who have an inclination towards technology, it might seem a little unrealistic, but I can assure you that the majority of people, even in your age group and my age group, simply do not understand how technology works. They have absolutely no idea. They've got a fancy phone. They know how to download apps in the App Store. They know how to maybe change the wallpaper, a couple little things like that. But as far as like how all of it's all connected and how all of it works, it's all this one great big mystery. It's all magic on the back end. So that would be like a casual user. There's a couple of levels beyond that, but for the purposes of the victimology of wire fraud, generally speaking, anybody who has anything above that level of technical ability is not often selected because, well, like for example, an example of wire fraud on a casual user, so likely a slightly younger victim, might be something along the lines of the Baltimore stockbroker scam. Baltimore stockbroker, if you're not familiar how the scam works, let's divide the class here in two, okay? I tell both of you the same thing. I send you an email and I say, I'm looking for investors, but don't worry, I'm not asking for any money right now. I'm going to prove myself to you. I have a computer system that I have designed, and it can predict with 100% accuracy who the winners and the losers in the stock market are going to be. I'm not asking for any money. I'm just going to prove it to you. I'm telling you right now that next week, GME is going to the moon. Okay? I tell the other group of people, I'm telling you, next week, GME going down. Sell now. Well, one or the other is going to happen. The one that happens, I go back to that group. The other guys, they know I'm full of shit now. Forget it. You guys are out. My investors. Last week, I told you GME would crater, and it did. This week, a proprietary computer algorithm tells me that the next one that's going to go up, AMC, going to the moon. I tell the other half in the back, going to crater. Whichever one happens, that's the group I go to. Everyone else knows I'm full of shit now. It's an ever smaller group, but eventually I get to 5 or 6 correct predictions, and you're on the hook because from your perspective, I was right 100% of the time. Now, for a casual user, well, the proof is in the pudding, right? I've already proven myself 5 or 6 times. To a power user, someone who understands stock market or how trades work or email scams, that kind of thing, they're more likely to call me out on it. more likely to push back with some questions. Well, how does this really work? That kind of thing. Sometimes, you know, if you're committed to the bit, you can keep pushing and get somebody back on board, but it's usually not worth it because it's just an email scam. So casual users might fall into that group because they feel like it's been proven. They don't know what questions to even ask to suss out the truth. And so what's the problem after all? Wire fraud generally takes the form of what are known as confidence scams. It's exactly what I just demonstrated there. Confidence scams are essentially scams that require building and maintaining some form of trust with a mark. You never go out and ask immediately for too much. You try to prove yourself first, and that proof is, of course, BS. Takes many different forms. Victimology changes depending on the forms. One that's not on here, for example, romance scams. There's a lot of that going around right now, by the way. I've heard through sources in the underground computer criminal community. No, for real though, romance scams are on the rise. Typically, victimology for romance scams, same group as for online shopping and auction scams, female 30 to 49. Generally going to be the casual user or functionally illiterate sort of categories, depending on socioeconomic status, generally with that age group and so on. A lot of them are coming through social media, of course, you know, particularly Facebook, which is where that demographic can most likely be found, and so on. Computer software fraud, like the tech support scammers we looked at before. Typically, the two main victim pools there, men 60 to 79, women 40 to 59, not because men tend to have a higher rate of literacy when it comes to technology. That's not the case at all. It's just that typically when you contact a man in any other age group and you tell them they have a problem with something, they're going to try and fix it themselves rather than rely on tech support to do it for them. And it's just harder to hook them. Malware, spyware, same thing. Hacking and social media, again, we're back up. That's a mixed group, men and women. In terms of victimology of social media hacking, an equal pool. Most social media users in that age group tend to be less tech savvy than others. Although I will say, interestingly enough, there is another trend right now when it comes to not wire fraud, but in terms of account compromise. A lot of the social media platforms that are in use with the Zoomers these days, the younger generation, people like my teenagers, rife right now with scammers. Not looking for money because they don't have any goddamn money, they're kids, but looking for accounts, trying to compromise accounts, using those to legitimize or legitimate, as it's called, other sock puppet accounts and so on. Crazy stuff going on in social media with the Zoomers right now. There is a victimology report here with the City of London. It's a little bit old at this point, but it's still a pretty good picture of what the victimology of wire fraud looks like. It's basically what I just broke down for you, but if you want to read it for yourself, do recommend City of London right there, that PDF. Now, of course, one of the primary victims of cybercrime is businesses. Individuals are targeted, but businesses are as well. And it's kind of hard, unless you look at the numbers yourself, to understand exactly what's at stake with businesses here, because to listen to the industry, the cybersecurity industry, of course, on the one hand, you always have professionals telling, well, everyone's an equal victim, and it could be anybody, it could happen to you, so on and so forth. And of course, the really big breaches are the ones that get the most attention, the millions of records or billions of records in at least one case. They tend to make the news the most. So, you know, you might develop a false sense of victimology here for data breaches, because you might think, okay, well, it's got to be, well, let's say like entertainment, right? Sony was a huge breach. You might think retail, Target was a huge breach, or something like that. But you always think big companies. But truly, not the case. Chances are, if you were to get a position at a smaller company, it will either be just after they have a breach, or one is likely just around the corner, statistically speaking. So for businesses, and this is, again, this study is a little bit older as well. This is 15 years old now, but just take what I'm about to tell you, read the DBIR, the Verizon data breach investigation report. And you can extrapolate as necessary. It hasn't changed very much since 2005. So typically, victims in terms of corporations or LLCs that are a victim of cybercrime, usually in the industries of telecommunications, manufacturing, or healthcare. They will either be extremely large with over 1,000 employees. That's extremely large as classified in the study. I would say 1,000 employees isn't all that large, at least not anymore. So over 1,000 or just under 1,000, somewhere underneath that. However, most attacks by number, not in terms of devastation or cost or loss. Most attacks are actually on very small businesses of 50 or fewer because they're easier. Most of them are targeted for trade secrets or PII. No longer are they stealing credit card numbers or customer information, payment information, I should say, or anything like that. More they're looking for sensitive information, something that they can sell for some kind of profit to another cyber criminal. Trade secrets are always valuable, which is why they're also targeted most of the time. Usually, social engineering attack is the main vector, but the social engineering attack is an avenue for a malware payload. Usually with the intent to steal, if it's an inside actor, or a denial of service attack, or just downtime for an outsider. And the reason that breaches are in the news all the time when they're big is because we don't actually hear about very many of the other ones. Most of them don't even bother reporting them to the authorities. They just do their legal disclosure, fire their cybersecurity employees, hire another one, and repeat. So here's some tables from the study. I'm not going to go through each of them, but yeah, number of employees, pretty significant as far as that's concerned. However, after you get under 1,000, note that even very small companies, 2 to 24 people, 50% likelihood here of some kind of an incident within the first years of operation. And with telecommunications and other industries, also, while telecommunications is number one, it's not that much different. Trade secrets is way up, however. Copyrighted material, second after that, and so on. Now, one of the other things that we have to deal with here in terms of attacks on businesses, of course, it's known as threading. Essentially, attacks will very rarely take a single vector, a single attack. They're usually going to be multifrontal and usually be tailored if it's a persistent attack or if it's an offender with a uniquely attractive target. They, of course, tailor their attack to their victim, making it all the more convincing in their social engineering attacks, all the more novel in the malware they use. Very rarely will an attacker in this fashion simply just throw things against the wall and see what sticks. It's usually not a very efficient or effective method. So multiple fronts. All right, as far as laws go, and we'll get to why we're talking about laws here in just a moment, but as far as laws go, there's a couple of state laws we could talk about. Wisconsin certainly has some, but we're not going to focus on those so much. Again, if you haven't taken 361, you don't have this information. So allow me to quickly provide this to you. All right, so laws on the internet weren't originally a thing. We already talked about how in the 90s, that's when business came around on the internet, and that's when there was regulation. Regulation means laws, and laws means that the contracts are being enforced, and so on and so forth. The early days of the internet saw plenty of that in the commercialization. And we also had a bunch of new things to worry about, things that we previously had a concern with as a society, but which all of a sudden in the digital world became much easier to facilitate as far as crimes go. For example, trademark disputes, name disputes, enforceability of online contracts, and copyright issues all existed long before the internet, and yet now suddenly major problems as a result of the efficiencies brought by technology. And so for those existing problems, we tried to apply existing solutions and to mixed effects. And we're still to this day doing the same thing. If I haven't told the story before, I'll tell it now, I guess. The term for this is known as a Horse law. And the reason we call it that is because we had another major shift in technologies that changed the way that our lives operate. Back before the automobile, for example, pedestrians had the right of way, could walk in the middle of the street, horses had to stop for them, and so on. And then all of a sudden the automobile comes along, jaywalking is now a crime, and the act of simply using your own 2 feet to walk across the street, well, suddenly makes you liable for damages because cars own the road. Wasn't always the case. There were other laws that used to govern conveyances as well. Before the automobile, of course, the primary way that we got around other than our own 2 feet was by horseback, or usually a horse-drawn wagon of some kind or a carriage. And horses, being organic creatures, required things like eating and shitting in the streets. And occasionally, in order to drive them, a buggy whip to prod them forward or move side to side. The problem there was is that if the buggy whip were to somehow become unsecured or dropped by a driver, it could potentially fall into a neighboring wagon's axles, your own axles, or hit a pedestrian, and so on. So many jurisdictions passed laws requiring that all carriages come equipped with a buggy whip holder to prevent such things from happening. Now, when the automobile was invented, which at first was, of course, known as the horseless carriage, because that's how people knew conveyances back then, even though there was no horse in the horseless carriage, because the law said a buggy whip holder must be equipped, horseless carriages still had to have buggy whip holders equipped for horses that did not exist, whips that did not exist, and so on. And so we call them horse laws. The current incarnation of the copyright laws of the United States, largely governed by what's known as the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which we already talked about a little while ago, is an example of such a horse law. It is actually a law that was invented after computer copyright issues became a problem, because we were already applying horse laws like the Lanham Act, which were grossly insufficient for this new problem that we were facing. Other examples for, let's see here, spam. Spam is illegal. How do we know it's illegal? How do we make it illegal? Well, what we do is we extend an old English common law, trespass to chattels. Chattel is basically you own something, trespass is trespass. English common law would use that trespass to chattels law, for example, for neighboring dairy farmers who allowed their herd to wander into a pasture that didn't belong to them. Well, that same law came from jolly old England all the way over here to the United States, entered our own legal system, and now we use that to prosecute spammers, keep sending us emails. Other examples of horse laws. Well, we just got done talking about Miller v. California and all of those obscenity and indecency laws. Of course, that was a problem long before the internet. Most of the laws that we extend to that are horse laws as well. But eventually we had to address this issue, and we haven't, by the way, spoiler alert, we haven't. Computers have been around for damn near 70 years. We still don't have a real good answer for a lot of the problems. We're still using old laws in a lot of cases, and a lot of the new laws we've passed, well, they're just not that great. They just don't work that well because the legal system moves so much more slowly than technology. Here in the jolly old WIS, we have a couple of laws on the books that govern those sorts of things. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but you should know that they are here. If you're going to be a cybersecurity professional, you definitely need to acquaint yourself with Wisconsin 13498, our data breach notification law, which requires all people who are the victims of a data breach, that is the actual person themselves, not a public release, not a general release to all customers, but just those that are affected. If their personal information as defined in the law is leaked, they must be notified within 45 days. We also have, again, the unlawful use of computerized communications we just talked about. And we also have a computer crimes law, which I will leave as an exercise to the listener to investigate on your own. But the big one here in the United States is the federal law, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the CFAA, which we talked about before. The CFAA is a response from the 1980s when Reagan was elected on the campaign promise to get tough on crime, to succeed where Nixon failed in the war on drugs, to finally put an end to the crack epidemic, and so on and so forth. Also, suddenly having to deal with these newfound computer criminals we were talking about earlier this semester. So passed as part of the Omnibus Crime Bill following 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and since revised in 88, 89, 90, 94, 96, and so on and so forth. It is the federal law that covers the abuse of computer systems. In short, not to read the whole slide to you, in short, it started out as a way for the government to protect government computers. The original incarnation basically said that the law extends to any computer system used by or for the United States government. Later on amended to include B, which is also computers that are used in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce or communication. And you might be saying to yourself, well, that sounds like everything. Yeah, it's everything. It's everything. Their definition of a computer also extends to, of course, desktops, laptops, phones, GPS, whatever you can, whatever a digital device you can possibly name, it's considered a computer for this particular law here. Now that seems pretty cut and dry. The CFAA, it applies to everything. It's a federal law. There you go. There are some notable exceptions in this case because just like every law, if it goes to court, it gets argued, the judge decides, and based on their decision, they establish what's known as case law. Case law are basically de facto laws where a judge has heard the facts, or well, a trier of facts, but judge in the end anyway, even in the case of jury trials, issues essentially a ruling, and that is how many laws are actually struck down. That's what happened with Roe v. Wade not that long ago. That's what happened with COPPA back when it was first passed in '96. It's happened here to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act several times. For example, one notable case, the CFAA, US v. Kane, is a case wherein an individual went into a casino to one of the video poker machines. And after some experimentation and probably a fair amount of research beforehand, although I don't recall Kane actually admitting that, figured out that by pressing a series of button combinations on the front, he could force the machine to pay out. He was arrested and, of course, tried as a violation of the CFAA. The Supreme Court ruled, however, that number one, a video poker machine is not a computer which is used somehow in interstate or foreign commerce. All right. And also that exploiting a bug and touching the outside of a machine, which of course they want you to touch if you're going to play the game, did not constitute where is it? Not trespassing, accessing a computer to defraud and obtain value. Did not constitute exceeding authorized access. So while Kane still did have to face wire fraud charges, could not be tried under the CFAA according to the Supreme Court. So this is the kind of thing, in addition to that the CFAA will cover. Of course, the government computer system thing was originally passed to protect that because everyone was terrified of Matthew Broderick in War Games. Scariest villain in all of human history, according to the parents of the 1980s. Obtaining national security information, accessing a computer and obtaining information, trespassing in a government computer, of course. But also things like intentionally damaging by knowing transmission. So there's another case that did not go to the Supreme Court, but which is also interesting. Back down in Madison, there was a gentleman by the name of Malta who was arrested and tried and convicted under Wisconsin's computer crime laws, but federal charges were considered in that case. What Malta did is was a denial of service attack. Got himself a radio jammer and essentially flooded the frequency used by emergency services in the city of Madison and broadcast porn over it for 5 days. until finally they found him and shut him down. And the intentionally damaging by knowing transmission was the federal charge that was considered. However, the state of Wisconsin refused to hand the case over. We wanted to try it ourselves. So just got charged with Wisconsin's computer crimes. Recklessly damaging by intentional access. So even if you have access to a computer system, or if you don't, but an inside actor is also covered by the CFA. You don't have to break into a computer in order to do it. If you damage a process that you do have access to, if it's reckless damaging, you could still be tried under this. And look at the penalties we have here: 1 year, 5 year. The worst ones, of course, being the government computers thing. Trafficking in password can get you 1 or to 10 years with a maximum sentence. Extortion involving computers can as well. The CFAA was the law under which a lot of revenge porn entrepreneurs were tried not that many years ago, which is why places like Pornhub and other places completely removed those categories from their site because they didn't want to be involved in any extortion cases and so on. 5 to 10 years. All right, so we've been talking about the law. We've actually been talking about a lot of things all semester. It's time to put a name to it. There's a name for all this. We've been talking about legals. We've been talking about the legal code. We've been talking about social norms. We talk about how the market influences sites and influences our behavior, about how the marketplace is online these days, political forum is online these days. Well, there is a name for this. The factors of online communications that regulate in some fashion behavior, the behavior of the people who go on it, behavior of the businesses that go on it, the way that we all interact. It's known as Lessig's framework. So Lessig's framework, as we've hinted upon throughout the semester, has 4 legs, 4 things essentially that restrain and control behavior on the internet. The law, as we just got done talking about, is definitely one of those. Just like in real life, the purpose of the law is social control. That's why jaywalking is illegal. It's not because the government wants to protect you from getting hit by a car. It's because automobile lobbyists lobbied the government to change the laws to make walking illegal in case you get hit by a car, because otherwise you're blaming the driver or the car. We can't have that. So jaywalking is illegal because it's a form of social control. You can't walk here. It's also why we have crimes that are known as victimless crimes, right? You can't go in the state of Wisconsin, at least not just yet. You can't go buy hash or something like that. It's illegal, right? Who gets hurt? You get what you want, they get what they want. Well, that's a victimless crime. They say it's a crime on society. And at least for drugs, at least, there's an argument to be made for public health. But ultimately, what that's really about, because many of the drugs that are Schedule I drugs, for example, at least for now, are psychoactive but relatively harmless otherwise, is because it's disorderly. They don't want people doing that. So it's against the law. It's social control. Norms we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about deviant subcultures, social bonding, the Merton typology, and so on. Those are all social norms. Social norms, we feel them in real life to one degree or another. The law in Lessig's framework is known as a strong force because you're literally being handed rules to live by. Norms under Lessig's framework are known as a diffuse force. It's peer pressure, it's influence. It's what makes, like, for example, smoking cigarettes. When I was a kid, I mean, we knew about the dangers of smoking at that point. No longer could they be denied by tobacco companies, but it was something that a lot of people did. The older generation, they all smoked. It was just a normal thing to do. These days, you don't see it so much anymore, although it seems to be making a comeback if social media tells me anything, weirdly enough. But it's a norm that tells us, that's not acceptable to do in certain places or among certain groups. It's why humor has changed significantly in the few decades that I've been alive, and so on. Now, we are also influenced and restrained by the market. We've been feeling that a lot lately with supply chain issues since the pandemic first struck. We are changing our habits based upon availability of goods. We are putting in overtime in order to afford more goods, and so on. But market forces are another diffuse force for individuals on the internet. They are a strong force for businesses on the internet. Market dictates a lot of what happens and decisions that are made with regards to those corporations, because while of course they have to follow the law, just like all of us, honestly, they have a different set of laws. And I'm not saying that in like a sarcastic way. Literally, corporations, the reason that you form an LLC, if you have a business. If you don't have an LLC, by the way, file some paperwork. You're going to want to do this because just forming an LLC indemnifies you as an individual from a lot of activity your business does. Even if you are the one running it, you are exempt from a lot of legal ramifications should something happen. So they're not in a sarcastic way. I'm not being sardonic here. Literally, there are different laws for businesses than there are for people. So, of course, they have to follow the law. They have to do the SOX thing. They have to worry about Section 230 not falling afoul of that. But last week we were talking about 3 volunteer moderators and about how this is done even when they technically don't have to, right? Section 230 protects them pretty well from anything posted on their site. So why do they do it? Well, because for them, the law is a force on them, but the market is really what pushes them to make these decisions. It's a much stronger force for businesses because it is so easy to be pushed out of the market. Think about what makes Elon Musk wants to buy Twitter. What makes Twitter special? The answer, absolutely nothing. There's absolutely nothing special about Twitter. The only thing that makes Twitter special is because that's what everybody's using. MySpace was special in 2005 too. Not anymore. And it's not worth anything. Why? Well, it isn't because they decided to do anything different. Facebook came along, took all their subscribers. Now it's not worth shit. Well, anyway, and so you get the last one is architecture. And that's a universal factor online. That's a universal guiding force, a restraint on everyone. Architecture is the term that Lessig uses for basically what is technically possible right now, right? We can't do certain things because the technology of the web or the technology where we're at with computers or VR or whatever just isn't there yet. The market share for Facebook has been going down for years. But since they started this whole meta thing, they've been dumping lots of money into trying to make Mark happy. And it's down 60% over the last year because they're pushing so hard on this meta thing. They have legs now, by the way. Here you got legs on meta. But they're constrained. Well, Mark's got himself an idea. That's not constrained by anything, right? He's a billionaire, so anything he imagines he thinks can be accomplished, but they're finding out that that's not necessarily the case because architecturally, technology is just not there. They just can't achieve what they want to achieve with what they have. It's a future state. So everyone is affected by that because businesses can't offer more than architecture allows. Users can't take advantage of more than architecture allows. Their ability to interact between each other is limited by that, and so on. So this is Lessig's framework. Now, we also talked a little while ago about social engineering tactics, and I wasn't going to talk about specific things, but since we're talking about Lessig's framework in this unit, I think we can return to that because ultimately, the more influential force on users on the internet tends to be diffuse. So we were talking about Godwin's law and Cunningham's law and Poe's law last week as well. Both of those essentially are eponymous laws of the internet that arise out of norms, and norms change all the time. And one of the biggest problems, if we're going to ever start talking about misinformation and disinformation, as we will later this semester, is identifying these tactics, because they've become so commonplace, just as making comparisons, someone you don't like to a Nazi on the internet used to be so common back in the Usenet days, that Godwin himself lent his name to the rule. So I'm going to talk about a couple of rhetorical tricks here. And hopefully, once I point these out to you, you will find that people are doing them probably to you all the time. So first of all, what's known as gish galloping, which is actually a debate tactic. So you might be familiar with this if you've ever had a conversation with somebody and they're just inundating you with information. First of all, this, then that, and then there's this other thing, and number 3 and number 4 and so on. Whenever somebody starts numbering shit off to you and they start talking really fast, it usually means that they're gish galloping. It's a debate tactic where essentially you avalanche a person with information and so many points that you can't possibly refute all of them. You can't even remember how their sentence started. You see this on the internet all the time. Generally, I should also point out, none of these are effective ways to social engineer somebody. That's not what we're talking about here anymore. These are rhetorical tricks. These are ways to influence other people. So if you see 2 morons in a slap fight on Twitter or Reddit or something like that, and one of them is doing this, most assuredly, they're not trying to win the argument. They're trying to convince other people that are following it because they seem like they know what they're talking about more. So one side will just post a bunch of stuff, TLDR, wall of text, and then of course the other person will pick one thing out of the list. And what's the reply afterwards? I see you have nothing to say on my other 37 points, right? Don't forget about bullshit, subsection bullshit. This is actually one that is used all the time by attorneys as well. Also, sometimes goes hand in hand with technobabble, but generally with this, what we're really talking about is officious language or archaic language, something that you have to stop and look up a word before you can even understand what their point is, kind of a thing. Or just saying things that are absolutely not true is another example of bullshit, subsection bullshit. This works because of what's known as the bullshit asymmetry principle, which is that the amount of energy required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than the energy required to produce it. And so you'll see individuals using this rhetorical trick on social media, for example, simply saying things. You could consider this kind of like a human denial of service attack, right? Because you say something or somebody says something, it's maybe even obviously wrong, but has enough verisimilitude that makes somebody stop and think twice. But the amount of time it takes to refute it, because it's so ridiculous, isn't worth their time. And so what do people following the conversation see? This person makes a point. It could be true, I don't know. The other person didn't bother to reply. Well, obviously they tuck tails and run. They were wrong and they couldn't face it. Some of these you might have heard of, like the Chewbacca defense from South Park, presenting a distracting argument that is facile and specious by presenting the correlation of non sequiturs. Specious essentially meaning like it's absolutely false, but on the face of it, but appears to be legitimate at first blush. So the correlation of non sequiturs. So for example, did you know that the number of people that drown in pools increases every time Nicolas Cage releases a new movie? Clearly, Nicolas Cage is drowning people in pools. Filibustering, I'm sure you're familiar with, probably heard about it somewhere or another, but controlling or dominating the conversation, just endless. You probably have had a couple of these maybe with a friend or a significant other, just endless text after text after text. Filibustering. The nail in the coffin, this one's a good one. I gotta get to the nail in the coffin. Nail in the coffin. Whoever talks last wins, basically. And this is actually, interestingly enough, part of the reason for one of our legal traditions here in the United States, wherein in every trial, the prosecution will give their closing statement first and the defense always second, because it is a fairly well-known weakness, I suppose, of human preference for information. We tend to remember two things best, those with primacy and those with recency. So if we give somebody a list of information, they will remember the first things and the last things. The first things because they're primacy, they came first, and the last things because of recency. And so, yeah, literally whoever speaks second usually wins, because that's what people remember the most. And as you can see there, as long as you deliver it in a way that is convincing enough, well, you get somewhere with it. A couple of other things here. Proof by intimidation, known in maths, just hand waving arguments away, saying, well, obviously, no need to look into that. Ad hominems online. I can't remember the last time I saw an argument between people online that didn't devolve into ad hominems. It's logical fallacy, where instead of attacking the argument, you attack the person making the argument or something like that. In addition to that, no true Scotsman and cherry picking. The no true Scotsman thing, if you're not familiar with that, the story goes that in Scotland, there's an elderly couple, and every day the gentleman picks up the paper and complains about foreigners and whatnot that he sees in the paper, particularly the English, of course, because this is Scotland. And so he reads in the paper that there's been a break-in at a local shop, and he says, well, certainly no Scotsman would do that. The paper the next day releases the name of the individual, and it turns out that he's from Scotland, has a Scottish name, and indeed lives down the block. And so he moves the goalpost and says, well, no true Scotsman would do a thing like that. Cherry picking, intentionally including select examples, no true Scotsman, intentionally excluding counterexamples, anything that would refute an existing held belief. Well, let's get to the good stuff here. This is running low on time. Now, sea lining, trolling tactic, more popular than ever, particularly on Twitter. As a matter of fact, sea lining basically defines Twitter these days. It's a troll which feigns ignorance and politeness, basically asking continually for debate or bad faith arguments. It comes from a comic strip, and once you see it, you will know. This is why they call it sea lining. Damn sea lions. So now that you know where it comes from and you see that, I'm sure you'll also see this everywhere. Again, it's pretty much all over the place. Bad faith's invitation to engage in debates. Any sources that are provided, of course, will never be always be substandard, or will simply be ignored, and just continually saying, "Oh, I see that you're not being reasonable here." Gaslighting, I'm sure everyone at this point is familiar with. It was far less of a common term years ago when this slide was originally put together. Virtual trolling or virtual signaling as well. Concern trolling probably as well. Maybe less familiar with the terms sophists or iconoclasts. There's nothing wrong with being either of those things, but of course there is a right way and a wrong way to be pedantic, and too often the wrong way is chosen. So with iconoclasts or sophists, trolls, essentially, again, playing to the audience, will always be willing to provide sources upon sources, but it turns out that the sources that they provide are intellectually dishonest. They're constantly using logical fallacies and so on, but they appear with enough verisimilitude to fool somebody who doesn't follow the links or doesn't understand exactly what they're Let's leave it at that because next time we will watch Real Future Daring Hackers to Hack You, and we will move on to, oh yes, we'll move on to virality and memes again. Great. See you guys next time.